Have you ever stood up to someone who thought they could take what's yours? Black woman asked to switch VIP seats for white passenger. One call later, the entire team is fired. What would you do if someone tried to take what was rightfully yours simply because they thought they were more important? On a seemingly ordinary flight, one woman's calm defiance turned an act of entitlement into a lesson no one on board would ever forget. Stay tuned, this is a story of quiet power, shocking twists, and ultimate karma. Before we begin, where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments. If you love inspiring stories of resilience and justice, make sure to hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe for more incredible tales on dark stories. Your support helps us share these impactful stories with even more people. Now, let's get into it. The soft hum of the airplane engines filled the air as Maya Carter settled into her plush first-class seat. She exhaled deeply, savoring a moment of peace after a grueling week of back-to-back meetings. Her window seat offered a perfect view of the airport tarmac, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. It was a moment she had earned, a small luxury she allowed herself after years of relentless hard work. Maya's life hadn't always been this way. She grew up in a modest neighborhood, her parents instilling in her a fierce determination to rise above the limitations society often imposed. As the founder and CEO of a thriving tech company, Maya now stood as a symbol of resilience and success. This flight was supposed to mark the beginning of a new chapter, a trip to finalize a major international partnership that could propel her business to unprecedented heights. She adjusted the silk scarf around her neck and reached for her leather briefcase. The scent of fresh coffee lingered in the cabin, mingling with the faint aroma of designer perfumes worn by her fellow passengers. A steward passed by, offering a warm smile as he handed her a glass of sparkling water. Maya accepted it with a nod, savoring the crisp bubbles against her lips. Everything felt perfect. But perfection, as Maya would soon learn, could be fleeting. Hold on, could this calm woman really turn the tables on a demanding passenger? A commotion at the front of the cabin snapped her out of her thoughts. Maya glanced up, her gaze locking onto a tall blonde woman entering the first-class section. The woman's posture screamed entitlement, her designer handbag dangling from her elbow as if it were a badge of honor. Behind her trailed a slightly shorter companion, their whispered conversation just loud enough for Maya to catch snippets of it. Can you believe the airline? This seat assignment is ridiculous, the blonde muttered, her voice dripping with disdain. Her companion, a brunette with a nervous laugh, replied, I know, Evelyn, but maybe it's just a mistake, they'll fix it. Maya felt a prickle of unease as the two women stopped beside her row. Evelyn's sharp gaze flicked to Maya, her perfectly manicured fingers tapping impatiently against her handbag. Maya returned her attention to the briefcase on her lap, unwilling to engage. She had dealt with people like Evelyn before, people who saw her skin color before her accomplishments, who assumed her place in the world was up for negotiation. Excuse me, Evelyn said, her tone clipped. Maya looked up, meeting her gaze. Yes? Maya replied, her voice calm and measured. I believe there's been a mistake, Evelyn said, gesturing toward Maya's seat. This is obviously meant for someone else. Maya arched an eyebrow. This is my seat, I reserved it weeks ago. Evelyn's lips curled into a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. You see, I'm a gold tier member with this airline. I always get priority seating. You might be more comfortable elsewhere. Maya stared at her for a moment, letting the weight of the woman's audacity sink in. I'm quite comfortable where I am, thank you. Evelyn's smile vanished, her companion shifting uncomfortably, clearly wishing to avoid further conflict. Before Evelyn could respond, a flight attendant appeared, his crisp uniform adding an air of authority. Is there an issue here? He asked, his gaze darting between the two women. Yes, there is, Evelyn said, her voice taking on a dramatic lilt. This seat, my seat, has been mistakenly assigned to someone else. I need it resolved immediately. The attendant glanced at Maya, who offered a calm but pointed response. There's no mistake, this is my seat, and I have the ticket to prove it. The attendant hesitated, caught between Evelyn's assertiveness and Maya's quiet confidence. Let me check your ticket again, ma'am, he said to Maya, his tone polite but faintly skeptical. Maya handed over her boarding pass without a word, her heart steady despite the growing tension. She had been here before, in boardrooms, on stages, in countless subtle confrontations where she had to prove she belonged. This was just another test. The attendant examined the ticket and nodded. This is indeed your seat, Miss Carter. Evelyn's eyes narrowed, and for a brief moment, her polished veneer cracked. That can't be right, she must have bought a last-minute upgrade. People do that, don't they? Maya bit back a sharp retort. Instead, she fixed Evelyn with a steady gaze. I suggest you take your assigned seat. This conversation is over. Evelyn's companion tugged at her arm, whispering something inaudible, but Evelyn wasn't ready to let it go. I'm not sure you understand who I am, she said, her voice low but seething. I always fly first class. I'm not about to let someone like Evelyn's friend hissed, cutting her off. The flight attendant cleared his throat. I'm sorry, ma'am, but if you have any further concerns, you're welcome to speak with our supervisor. Evelyn glared at him, her frustration barely contained. Finally, with a huff, she stormed toward the front of the cabin, dragging her reluctant companion behind her. The flight attendant gave Maya an apologetic look before retreating to handle other duties. Maya watched them go, her expression unreadable. She could feel the stares of the other passengers, their curiosity heavy in the air. It wasn't the first time she had been singled out in such a way, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. But Maya wasn't about to let anyone diminish her, not today, not ever. Leaning back in her seat, she took a sip of her water and closed her eyes. This was far from over, and deep down, she knew it. Maya leaned back in her seat, flipping through the pages of a sleek leather-bound notebook she carried everywhere. Her meticulous handwriting filled the pages, notes, strategies, and ideas for the deal she was set to close overseas. As she adjusted her reading glasses, a faint commotion caught her attention near the entrance of the first-class cabin. The door had just opened to allow the remaining passengers to board. A tall, elegantly dressed woman with platinum blonde hair swept into the cabin, flanked by another woman carrying an oversized designer tote. The first woman moved with an air of entitlement, her head tilted high as if the world existed solely to cater to her needs. She paused in the aisle, her sharp gaze scanning the rows like a hawk searching for prey. Maya caught the subtle narrowing of the woman's eyes as they landed on her. It wasn't the first time she'd encountered that look, a mix of curiosity and judgment laced with the unspoken question, "What are you doing here?" "Excuse me," the woman said sharply, waving at a passing flight attendant, her voice cultured but carrying a distinct edge of impatience. "This must be a mistake, my seat is supposed to be here." The flight attendant, a young man with neatly combed hair and a slightly nervous demeanor, smiled politely. "What seat number, ma'am?" 1A, of course, I always book 1A, she replied, her tone dismissive. She gestured vaguely toward Maya, her manicured finger pointed like an accusation. But clearly, there's been a mix-up. Maya's heart sank. She knew where this was going before it even began. The flight attendant checked his tablet and smiled apologetically. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but 1A is correctly assigned to Miss Carter here. She booked it in advance." The woman's jaw tightened. "And what am I supposed to do about that?" she asked, her voice rising slightly. "I'm a loyal customer of this airline, a very loyal customer. Surely there's some accommodation you can make." The attendant shifted uncomfortably. "We can try to arrange something," he said, but Maya interrupted, her voice calm but firm. She looked up, meeting the woman's gaze squarely. "There is nothing to arrange. This is my seat, and I intend to keep it." The woman blinked, as if startled that Maya had spoken. "Well," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "I'm sure you'd be more comfortable in another seat, perhaps in business class." Maya's expression didn't waver. She had spent years navigating boardrooms filled with people who underestimated her, and this moment was no different. "I'm perfectly comfortable where I am," she said evenly. The air around them seemed to shift, the quiet tension of the first-class cabin turning sharp. Other passengers pretended not to notice, their eyes glued to their tablets and books, but Maya felt their curiosity, their silent judgment, like a weight pressing on her. "Let me handle this," the flight attendant said quickly, trying to de-escalate the situation. He turned to Maya, his voice polite but carrying an undertone that grated on her nerves. "Miss Carter, would you mind moving to another seat, perhaps 2C? It's still in first class, and it would allow us to accommodate Mrs. Stokes." So that was her name, Mrs. Evelyn Stokes, the kind of name that came with country clubs and generational wealth, Maya thought. She leaned back in her seat and folded her arms. I booked this seat for a reason, she said, her voice calm but resolute. I won't be moving. Evelyn's face darkened. Unbelievable, she muttered under her breath, loud enough for Maya to hear. She turned to the flight attendant. Do you even know who I am? I'm a Platinum Elite member. I don't think this is how you want to treat one of your most loyal customers. The attendant swallowed, glancing between Evelyn and Maya. His hesitation said everything. He knew Evelyn had connections, and yet he also knew Maya was within her rights. But in this unspoken power dynamic, Maya could already feel where his loyalty lay. I'll get the supervisor, he said at last, retreating down the aisle. Evelyn turned back to Maya, her lips curling into a forced smile. You could have avoided all this, you know, she said, her tone saccharine and insincere. But I suppose some people just don't understand the meaning of compromise. Maya tilted her head, studying the woman before her. Compromise, she repeated softly, as if testing the word. Interesting choice of words. Evelyn's smile faltered. She opened her mouth to retort, but the arrival of the flight supervisor cut her off. A middle-aged woman with a crisp uniform and an air of authority approached, her heels clicking against the cabin floor. Is there a problem here? The supervisor asked, glancing between Maya and Evelyn. Before anyone could respond, Evelyn jumped in. Yes, there's a problem. I'm supposed to be in seat 1A, but somehow she ended up here. The supervisor's gaze landed on Maya, and for a brief moment, something flickered in her eyes of recognition, perhaps, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. Miss Carter, would you be willing to move to another seat just to resolve this quickly? Maya's fingers tightened around the armrest. She looked at the supervisor, then at Evelyn, and then at the other passengers who were still pretending not to listen. She could feel their silent expectations, the unspoken demand for her to be reasonable, to yield for the sake of keeping the peace. No, she said simply. Evelyn let out a sharp laugh. Unbelievable, she repeated, shaking her head. You're really going to make a scene over this? Fine, let's see how far this gets you. Maya smiled faintly, though her eyes remained steely. Let's. She reached for her phone and began typing a message, her calm demeanor never wavering as the tension around her grew thicker. She had dealt with people like Evelyn before, and she knew exactly how to handle them. The supervisor, Deborah Lane, shifted uncomfortably on her polished black heels, the weight of the escalating tension pressing down on her. As a seasoned airline professional, Deborah had dealt with her share of difficult passengers, but something about this situation felt different. She could sense that Evelyn Stokes wasn't just another disgruntled traveler. She was the kind of customer who believed she deserved preferential treatment simply because she existed. Deborah turned her attention to Maya, who remained seated with an air of calm authority. There was something unshakable about her, a quiet power that seemed to command the space without her needing to raise her voice. Deborah hesitated. Miss Carter, she began cautiously, keeping her tone neutral, I understand your position, but for the sake of resolving this quickly, would you reconsider moving to another seat? It's still in first class. No, Maya interrupted, her tone firm but devoid of anger. She didn't even look up from her phone, where she was still typing out a message. The supervisor's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes flickering to Evelyn, who was now pacing a small circle in the aisle, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Evelyn's face was a mix of indignation and impatience, as though she couldn't fathom why this conversation was taking so long. Deborah, Evelyn interjected, her voice dripping with entitlement. I don't understand why this is even a discussion. She's being unreasonable. I'm a Platinum Elite member, you know what that means, don't you? I've spent more on this airline than she probably makes in a year. I deserve that seat. The words hung in the air, sharp and deliberate. Several passengers in the cabin exchanged uneasy glances, though none of them dared to intervene. Maya finally looked up, her gaze locking onto Evelyn's with startling intensity. Mrs. Stokes, Maya said slowly, her voice smooth but laced with steel, your membership status has nothing to do with me. I paid for this seat, just like you paid for yours. If the airline made a mistake, that's their problem, not mine. Evelyn's cheeks flushed, her composure slipping. This isn't about the money, she snapped. It's about respect. People like you. She stopped short, as if realizing she had ventured into dangerous territory. Maya raised an eyebrow, her expression unwavering. People like me, she repeated softly, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying the weight of a thunderclap. The silence in the cabin was deafening, even Deborah seemed to shrink under Maya's gaze. Evelyn hesitated, floundering for words. I didn't mean it like that, she stammered, her confidence faltering. I just meant, well, you're clearly not a frequent flyer in first class, and I. Maya held up a hand, cutting her off. Stop, she said firmly. The authority in her voice made Evelyn recoil, but the woman quickly masked her discomfort with a haughty toss of her head. Fine, Evelyn said, turning back to Deborah. Are you going to let her get away with this? Deborah felt the eyes of the entire cabin on her, the weight of expectation crushing her. She had been trained to de-escalate situations, to prioritize customer satisfaction above all else, but this wasn't an ordinary dispute. She could see that Maya wasn't just another passenger to be placated or dismissed. There was something in the way she carried herself, something that warned Deborah against pushing too far. I'm afraid Miss Carter has the right to remain in her seat, Deborah said at last, her voice carefully measured. She booked it, and we cannot force her to move. Evelyn's face twisted in fury. Unbelievable, she shouted, her voice echoing through the cabin. This is the kind of service I get after all the money I've spent on this airline. I'll be speaking to corporate about this, mark my words. You do that, Maya said coolly, returning her attention to her phone. But Evelyn wasn't done. She turned on her heel and stormed down the aisle, muttering under her breath about entitled people and incompetent staff. Deborah let out a small sigh of relief, but it was short-lived. A few moments later, Evelyn returned, flanked by the flight attendant Greg, who looked both confused and alarmed. Evelyn had clearly decided that reinforcements were necessary to bolster her case. She refuses to cooperate, Evelyn announced loudly, gesturing toward Maya as though she were a misbehaving child. I demand that you do something about this. Greg looked at Maya, then back at Evelyn, his expression torn. He turned to Deborah, silently asking for guidance. Before Deborah could respond, Maya stood up. The sudden movement drew everyone's attention, and the cabin seemed to hold its collective breath. Maya's movements were deliberate and precise as she reached for her phone and pressed a button. The faint sound of a ringtone filled the air. I didn't want to do this, Maya said calmly, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. She glanced at Greg and Deborah, her eyes cold and calculating. But since you've decided to escalate, I'll escalate too. She turned her back to Evelyn and spoke into the phone. Yes, it's Maya Carter, she said, her tone professional but edged with irritation. I'm currently on one of your flights, and I'm having an issue with the staff. No, I'm not looking for compensation, I'm looking for accountability. The color drained from Deborah's face. Greg shifted uncomfortably, his hands clasping and unclasping in front of him. Evelyn frowned, clearly confused by the sudden turn of events. Maya continued, her voice unwavering. I'll expect a response before we take off, and if I don't get one, I'll assume this is a systemic issue and take it to the board. She paused, letting the words sink in. Thank you. She ended the call and slipped the phone back into her pocket, turning to Deborah. She smiled faintly. Now, she said, her voice dripping with quiet authority, let's see how corporate handles this. The first-class cabin seemed to hold its breath in the moments following Maya's decisive phone call. Maya returned to her seat, her expression calm, though her eyes carried a quiet fire. She picked up her leather notebook once again, flipping it open with deliberate care, as if the conversation had already been resolved in her favor. Deborah remained standing near the aisle, her usually confident posture faltering. The weight of Maya's last words, "Take it to the board," echoed in her mind like a warning bell. She had dealt with difficult passengers before, but something about Maya Carter's tone and composure told Deborah that this was no ordinary customer. Her instincts screamed at her to tread carefully, but the presence of Evelyn Stokes loomed large, demanding a resolution. Evelyn, however, was not a woman accustomed to waiting or losing. She crossed her arms tightly, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against her sleeve in frustration. The faint smirk she wore earlier had faded, replaced by a deep scowl. Well, Evelyn finally broke the silence, addressing Deborah with an imperious tone. Are you just going to stand there and let this nonsense continue? Deborah hesitated, glancing at Greg, who stood behind Evelyn, his posture stiff with discomfort. She knew she was walking a fine line. Choosing Evelyn meant risking Maya's wrath, potentially damaging the airline's reputation. If this woman truly had connections at the board level, but siding with Maya would mean incurring the ire of a Platinum Elite member, someone the airline valued as a frequent customer. "Mrs. Stokes," Deborah began cautiously, "I assure you we are handling the situation. Please take your seat for now, and I will follow up shortly." Evelyn's eyes narrowed, her nostrils flaring. "Take my seat? Take my seat? I'm supposed to be in her seat." She jabbed a finger in Maya's direction, her voice rising to a pitch that made several passengers wince. "Do you have any idea who I am?" It was a phrase Maya had heard countless times before. She didn't even bother looking up from her notebook, flipping a page as if Evelyn's tantrum was no more significant than the faint rustle of paper. Her nonchalance only seemed to fuel Evelyn's anger further. "I demand to speak to the captain," Evelyn said sharply. "This is completely unacceptable. If you won't fix this, I'll take it up with someone who will." At the mention of the captain, Deborah's composure cracked just slightly. Calling the captain into a passenger dispute was a last resort, an escalation that could disrupt the entire flight and delay departure. It wasn't a decision to be made lightly. She stepped forward, lowering her voice in an attempt to calm Evelyn. "Mrs. Stokes," she said firmly, "please understand that the captain's primary concern is the safety of the flight. This matter does not warrant his involvement. Let's resolve it here." But Evelyn was having none of it. "Oh, I see how it is," she snapped. "You're protecting her because you think she's more important than me. Well, let me tell you something, if I'm not in that seat by the time this plane takes off, your airline will be hearing from my lawyers." Maya sighed softly, finally closing her notebook with a quiet thud. She placed it on her lap and looked up, her eyes meeting Evelyn's with an expression that was equal parts calm and unyielding. "Mrs. Stokes," Maya said evenly, "if you truly believe your lawyers can resolve this, by all means proceed. But before you do, I suggest you consider the consequences of escalating a situation you're clearly not prepared to handle." Evelyn blinked, momentarily thrown off by the quiet authority in Maya's voice. "What's that supposed to mean?" she asked, her voice faltering for the first time. "It means," Maya replied, leaning forward slightly, "that throwing your weight around might work in some circles, but it won't work here, not with me, and certainly not with the board members who will be reviewing this incident." She sat back, her expression neutral but her eyes sharp. "So, I suggest you take your seat before you embarrass yourself further." The tension in the cabin was palpable. Deborah looked between the two women, her stomach twisting into knots. She could see Evelyn's face turning red, her jaw working furiously as she tried to formulate a response, but before she could speak, another voice cut through the silence. "Ladies," a deep, authoritative voice said from behind them. The captain himself had appeared at the entrance to the first-class cabin, his uniform crisp and his demeanor composed. His presence immediately commanded attention, and even Evelyn fell silent. "What seems to be the problem here?" he asked, his gaze sweeping over the scene with practiced neutrality. Deborah stepped forward quickly, hoping to defuse the situation before it spiraled further. "Captain, we're handling a minor seating issue, there's no need for your involvement." "I'll be the judge of that," the captain interrupted, his tone firm but calm. He turned to Evelyn, who immediately launched into a tirade about her Platinum Elite status, her loyalty to the airline, and the injustice of being denied her rightful seat. The captain listened patiently, his expression giving nothing away. When Evelyn finally finished, he turned to Maya, his eyes softening slightly. "And you, ma'am," he asked, "do you have anything to add?" Maya met his gaze without flinching. "No, Captain," she said simply. "I paid for this seat, and I intend to stay in it. If the airline made a mistake with Mrs. Stokes's reservation, that's unfortunate, but it's not my responsibility to fix." The captain nodded, his eyes lingering on Maya for a moment longer than necessary, then he turned back to Evelyn. "Mrs. Stokes," he said firmly, "I understand your frustration, but this seat was properly assigned to Miss Carter. I must ask you to return to your assigned seat so we can proceed with the flight." Evelyn stared at him, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "But that's final," the captain said, cutting her off. "If you refuse, I will have no choice but to remove you from this flight." The cabin erupted in a collective intake of breath. Evelyn looked around, her eyes wild, searching for someone, anyone, to take her side, but there was no sympathy to be found. Maya meanwhile picked up her notebook and opened it once again, her expression calm and unreadable. She didn't need to say anything more, the situation was already unraveling exactly as she'd expected. Evelyn clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. "This isn't over," she hissed, glaring at Maya as if she were the source of all her problems. But Maya didn't even look up, and for Evelyn, that was perhaps the greatest insult of all. Evelyn's furious footsteps echoed down the aisle as she begrudgingly retreated to her assigned seat. The cabin, now thick with tension, fell into an uneasy silence, broken only by the faint rustle of passengers shifting in their seats. The captain gave a small nod to Deborah, signaling that the matter was settled for now, and returned to the cockpit. Deborah exhaled quietly, trying to regain her composure. She could feel the weight of the situation lingering in the air, heavier than the crisp collar of her uniform. Evelyn might have been pacified temporarily, but the look in her eyes promised retribution. And then there was Maya, silent, composed, but undeniably powerful. Deborah couldn't shake the feeling that this incident was far from over. Maya flipped open her notebook once again, her fingers tracing the edges of the leather cover as if grounding herself. Her calm exterior was a practiced art, but beneath it, she felt the faint stirrings of frustration. This wasn't the first time she encountered such treatment, and though she rarely let it get under her skin, today felt different. Perhaps it was Evelyn's overt entitlement or the complicit hesitation of the crew, but something in her had shifted. Her phone buzzed softly in the pocket of her blazer, and she pulled it out with a quick, fluid motion. The screen lit up with a notification: incoming call, Marcus, Corporate Affairs. She smiled faintly. Marcus was efficient, sharp, and fiercely loyal, a trusted ally on the airline's corporate board. If anyone could address this situation swiftly, it was him. She pressed the phone to her ear, keeping her voice low to maintain discretion. "Marcus," she said, her tone steady but carrying an undertone of annoyance, "I need you to handle something." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Marcus spoke, his voice calm and professional. "I saw your message, what's going on?" Maya glanced around the cabin, ensuring her conversation remained private. "I'm on flight 827 to Zurich. The crew just tried to pressure me into giving up my seat for another passenger, a platinum elite member who thinks the world revolves around her." Marcus's sharp intake of breath was audible. "They what? You're kidding." "I wish I were," Maya replied. "It wasn't just a request, Marcus, it was a thinly veiled attempt to prioritize her over me because, in their eyes, she's more valuable. When I refused, it escalated. They called the supervisor, who asked me again, as though I hadn't already made myself clear." Marcus's tone darkened. "This is unacceptable. Do you have names?" "I do," Maya said. "The flight attendant, Greg, the supervisor, Deborah Lane, and, of course, our dear Mrs. Stokes." "Consider it handled," Marcus said firmly. "I'll escalate this to the CEO myself. They'll be lucky to keep their jobs by the time you land." Maya paused, her grip on the phone tightening. "Don't stop at firing them," she said quietly. "I want a systemic review. This isn't just about me, it's about how many others have been treated like this. I'm tired of these exceptions becoming the norm." Marcus's voice softened, his respect for her evident. "Understood, I'll start the process immediately. In the meantime, is there anything else you need?" Maya hesitated, her gaze drifting to the window. The fiery hues of the sunset had faded into a soft twilight, the runway lights glimmering faintly against the deepening sky. "No," she said at last, "handle the rest from here." She ended the call, slipping the phone back into her pocket. For a moment, she allowed herself a deep breath, letting the familiar rhythm of her heartbeat steady her nerves. The storm wasn't over, but she had set things in motion. Now all she had to do was wait. Across the aisle, Deborah watched Maya out of the corner of her eye, her unease growing by the second. The quiet confidence with which Maya had conducted herself wasn't just intimidating, it was unsettling. Deborah had dealt with plenty of demanding passengers in her career, but none had carried the quiet authority Maya exuded. Something about her demeanor suggested that she wasn't just another first-class traveler. Deborah glanced toward the galley, where Greg was leaning against the counter, his arms crossed. His usual air of casual confidence had all but disappeared, replaced by a nervous energy that made him fidget with his tie. Deborah decided to confront him. "Greg," she said, stepping into the narrow space, "we need to talk." He straightened, his expression defensive. "About what?" "This situation," Deborah said, lowering her voice. "I don't think you realize who we're dealing with." Greg scoffed, though the sound lacked conviction. She's just another passenger who thinks she's above everyone else. I don't see what the big deal is. Deborah frowned, her voice sharp. She's not just another passenger, Greg, she knows someone high up. Did you see how she handled this? She didn't even raise her voice, but she's already called someone outside the chain of command. I think we've made a mistake. Greg shifted uncomfortably, the weight of Deborah's words settling over him. You think she's connected? I think we need to be careful, Deborah replied, and I think you need to be prepared for the possibility that this might come back on us. Greg opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the intercom crackled to life. The captain's voice filled the cabin, calm and measured. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've received an update from corporate headquarters and will be making a brief delay at the gate before takeoff. We appreciate your patience and will provide additional details shortly. The announcement sent a ripple of murmurs through the cabin. Deborah's stomach dropped. A delay at this stage could only mean one thing: corporate was already involved. She turned to Greg, her expression grim. This isn't over, she said softly. Greg said nothing, but the look in his eyes spoke volumes. For the first time, he realized that they had underestimated Maya Carter, and that mistake could cost them everything. The hum of the engines had quieted, replaced by the faint rustling of passengers settling into their seats, their conversations muted as the announcement of the unexpected delay sank in. Maya closed her notebook again, resting her hands on the leather cover. Her calm demeanor remained intact, though the sharpness in her eyes hinted at the mental chess game she was already winning. She glanced out the window, the glow of the terminal lights reflecting faintly on the glass. This pause, she knew, wasn't just a coincidence. Marcus worked quickly, and if he was already pulling strings, things were about to unfold in ways no one here expected. Meanwhile, in the galley, Deborah and Greg huddled in hushed tones, their earlier tension now replaced with outright fear. I don't like this, Deborah muttered, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. She had spent years climbing the ranks of the airline, her reputation carefully cultivated through hard work and diplomacy, but now she could feel that foundation crumbling beneath her. That delay, it's corporate, someone called it in. Greg leaned back against the counter, running a hand through his neatly combed hair. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by a restless energy that made him look smaller somehow. So what if they did, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. It's not like we did anything wrong. We asked her to move politely, and she refused. End of story. Deborah shook her head. You're missing the point. This isn't about what we think we did, it's about perception. And if she's connected to someone high enough to trigger a delay like this, that perception could destroy us. Greg scoffed, but his shifting eyes betrayed his unease. She's just another passenger who's good at bluffing, probably knows someone in customer service and thought she'd scare us. I'm telling you, it's nothing. But even as he spoke, Greg felt the weight of Deborah's words settling in his chest like a stone. He had seen passengers threaten to escalate issues before, but none had the quiet certainty Maya displayed. It wasn't a bluff, it was a warning. Back in the first-class cabin, Evelyn Stokes sat rigidly in her seat, her fingers tapping against the armrest in an impatient rhythm. The delay had done little to calm her temper. If anything, it had fanned the flames. She couldn't shake the image of Maya's composed face, the way she had dismissed Evelyn's demands as though she were insignificant. She thinks she's better than me, Evelyn muttered under her breath, her lips curling into a sneer. Beside her, Linda shifted uncomfortably. Her earlier confidence in Evelyn's cause was now replaced with unease. Maybe we should just let it go, Linda whispered, her eyes darting toward the aisle where Deborah and Greg were still talking. This is getting messy. Evelyn shot her a withering look. Let it go? Do you know how much money I've spent with this airline, how many hours I've logged in first class? I'm not letting some nobody make a fool of me. Linda winced but said nothing, turning her attention to the in-flight magazine in her lap. Evelyn, however, wasn't done. She leaned forward, craning her neck to catch a glimpse of Maya, who sat serenely in her seat, her focus once again on her notebook. Unbelievable, Evelyn hissed. She just sits there, acting like she owns the place. A flight attendant passed by, and Evelyn flagged him down with a sharp wave of her hand. Are we taking off? She demanded, her voice cutting through the quiet cabin. This delay is unacceptable. The young man hesitated, clearly caught off guard. I'm sorry, ma'am, but the captain hasn't provided an update yet. We'll be underway shortly. Evelyn waved him off with a dismissive gesture, muttering under her breath as he retreated down the aisle. Maya didn't so much as glance in her direction, but Evelyn's anger simmered hotter with every passing second. 15 minutes later, the stillness of the cabin was broken by the soft hiss of the cabin door opening. Two sharply dressed men in suits stepped inside, their presence immediately drawing attention. One carried a sleek briefcase, while the other held a tablet in one hand, his expression unreadable. Maya's gaze flicked toward them, her lips curving into the faintest hint of a smile. Marcus never disappointed. The taller of the two men scanned the cabin briefly before his eyes landed on Deborah, who had stepped forward instinctively at their arrival. "Mississippi Lane?" he asked, his voice low but commanding. Deborah nodded, her throat dry. "Yes, I'm Deborah Lane, the flight supervisor. Can I help you?" "We're with corporate," the man said, holding up an ID badge. "We need to speak with you and the rest of your team immediately." Greg, who had been lingering nearby, froze mid-step, his face paling as he exchanged a glance with Deborah, who looked equally unsettled. "Is there a problem?" Deborah asked, though she already knew the answer. The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he gestured toward the galley. "We'll speak privately now." Deborah and Greg exchanged another look before following the men into the galley, their movements stiff and uncertain as the door to the cabin closed behind them. A ripple of murmurs spread through the passengers, even Evelyn sitting straighter, craning her neck to see what was happening. Maya meanwhile remained perfectly still, her hands resting lightly on her notebook. She didn't need to see what was happening in the galley, she already knew how this story would end. The gears were in motion, and there was no stopping them now. Inside the galley, the air was thick with tension. The two corporate representatives stood with practiced composure, their eyes sharp and assessing as they addressed Deborah and Greg. "We've reviewed the situation," the taller man began, his voice even but cold, "and we've spoken with key stakeholders regarding this flight. Effective immediately, both of you are being removed from duty." Deborah's eyes widened in shock. "Removed?" "But there's no room for negotiation," the man cut in, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Your conduct has been deemed unprofessional and inconsistent with the airline's policies. Further disciplinary action will be determined following a full investigation." Greg's mouth opened and closed, his usual arrogance replaced by sheer panic. "You can't be serious," he sputtered. This is a misunderstanding. We didn't do anything wrong." The second man, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. "We've reviewed passenger testimony and corporate records," he said firmly. "Your actions jeopardize the integrity of this flight and the airline's reputation. This decision is final." Deborah felt the world tilt beneath her feet, her years of service, her carefully built career, gone in an instant. Greg meanwhile had gone pale, his hands trembling as he tried to form a coherent response. "You're to leave the aircraft immediately," the first man said, gesturing toward the cabin door. "Security is waiting outside to escort you." As the two stunned crew members were led out of the galley, Maya turned her head slightly, watching them from the corner of her eye. The faintest trace of satisfaction flickered across her face, but she quickly masked it, returning her attention to her notebook. The sound of Evelyn's indignant voice rose once again, but this time it barely registered. Maya had already won the battle, and she knew the war was over too. The cabin door closed behind Deborah and Greg, the sound a sharp punctuation to the tension that had gripped the plane. For the first time since the commotion began, a hush fell over the first-class cabin. Passengers exchanged glances, whispering among themselves, though no one dared to speak loudly enough to be overheard. Maya remained seated, her posture relaxed as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. She knew better than to revel in the moment, it wasn't in her nature to gloat. Instead, she focused on what mattered most, the larger message this incident would send. This wasn't about revenge, it was about accountability. The two corporate representatives emerged from the galley and made their way down the aisle. One of them stopped at Maya's seat, inclining his head respectfully. "Miss Carter," he said softly, "everything has been resolved. Please accept our deepest apologies for the inconvenience and the way you were treated. The individuals involved are no longer part of this flight." Maya met his gaze evenly, her expression unreadable. "I appreciate the swift action," she said, her voice calm but carrying an edge that made the man straighten slightly. "However, I trust this won't end here. I expect a full review of the airline's policies and training procedures. This isn't the first time I've seen something like this, and I doubt it will be the last." "Of course, ma'am," the man replied quickly. We'll ensure that happens, you have my word. Maya nodded once, her attention shifting back to her notebook as if dismissing him. The man hesitated for a moment before retreating down the aisle, leaving her to her thoughts. She didn't need their promises, she had the influence to ensure they followed through, and she intended to use it. Across the cabin, Evelyn was seething, her face was flushed, her fingers clutching the armrest so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The smug satisfaction she had displayed earlier was gone, replaced by a simmering rage that seemed to radiate off her in waves. "This is ridiculous," Evelyn hissed under her breath, "absolutely ridiculous." Linda, seated beside her, leaned in cautiously. "Maybe it's best if we just let it go," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's not worth causing more trouble." Evelyn turned on her sharply, her eyes blazing. "Let it go? Do you realize what just happened? They threw me under the bus, me. I'm a Platinum Elite member. Do you have any idea how much I spend on this airline every year, and they're treating me like her." She spat the last word as though it were venomous, jerking her chin toward Maya's seat. Linda recoiled slightly, her gaze darting toward Maya, who remained utterly unbothered. If Maya had heard Evelyn's outburst, she gave no indication of it. Her calm demeanor only seemed to fuel Evelyn's anger further. "This isn't over," Evelyn muttered, her tone dark. "I'll make sure corporate hears about this. I have connections." Linda sighed, her unease growing. Evelyn's refusal to back down was beginning to feel less like determination and more like desperation. She didn't dare voice her thoughts, though, not with Evelyn in this state. The intercom crackled to life once more, and the captain's voice filled the cabin, steady and composed. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. As a reminder, safety and customer satisfaction are our top priorities. We'll be resuming our departure shortly. Thank you for your patience." The announcement seemed routine, but Maya noticed the subtle shift in tone, a hint of finality that signaled the flight crew had been instructed to ensure there were no further disruptions. The cabin doors remained closed now, and the faint tension in the air began to dissipate as passengers settled back into their routines. But for Evelyn, the captain's words were the final straw. She stood abruptly, her sudden movement drawing the attention of those around her. Her voice cut through the relative quiet, loud and indignant. "This is unacceptable," she declared, glaring down the aisle as if the corporate representatives might magically reappear. "I've been a loyal customer of this airline for years, and this is how I'm treated. I demand to speak to someone in charge now." Several heads turned, passengers exchanging uneasy glances. Even Linda looked embarrassed, sinking lower in her seat as if she could disappear entirely. Before anyone could respond, one of the corporate representatives returned, his expression unreadable. He approached Evelyn with deliberate calm, his voice low but firm. "Mrs. Stokes," he said, "we've been informed that your behavior has disrupted the cabin environment. Unfortunately, we must ask you to disembark the plane." The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. Evelyn's eyes widened in disbelief. "You can't be serious," she sputtered. "You're removing me, for what? For standing up for myself?" The man remained unmoved. "Our priority is ensuring a safe and comfortable experience for all passengers. Your conduct has made that difficult. Security is waiting outside to escort you from the plane." Evelyn's face turned a deep shade of red, her anger boiling over. "This is outrageous. Do you have any idea who I am?" The man didn't flinch. "Your status as a Platinum Elite member has been noted. However, it does not exempt you from following airline policies or respecting other passengers." For a moment, Evelyn looked as though she might argue further, but the murmurs spreading through the cabin made her hesitate. She glanced around, realizing for the first time that she had lost whatever sympathy she might have had. The other passengers' expressions ranged from disinterest to thinly veiled satisfaction. No one was on her side. Maya didn't even look up from her notebook as Evelyn was escorted down the aisle, her protests growing fainter with each step. The door to the cabin opened briefly, the sound of security guards speaking in low tones filtering in before it closed again, leaving behind only silence. The plane finally began its taxi to the runway, the hum of the engines returning as the tension dissipated entirely. Maya glanced out the window, the distant lights of the terminal shrinking as they moved forward. She allowed herself a small smile, calm, satisfied, and entirely self-assured. She had said nothing to Evelyn directly, but her presence alone had been enough. Maya understood that true power didn't require loud declarations or public victories. Sometimes, it was the quiet resolve to stand firm and let the system correct itself. As the plane lifted off into the night sky, Maya leaned back in her seat, her notebook resting on her lap. She didn't smile, but there was a quiet satisfaction in her eyes. She had fought this battle not just for herself but for every person who had ever been made to feel small. Weeks later, the airline released a public statement announcing new diversity and inclusivity training for all staff, along with stricter protocols for handling passenger disputes. The incident on Flight 827 was never mentioned by name, but those who knew understood that it had been a turning point. This was more than just a victory, it was a lesson. Respect isn't just a courtesy, it's a requirement, and those who forget it will always inevitably face the consequences. And just like that, the tables turned. What started as a simple act of entitlement ended with a powerful lesson in respect and humility. This story reminds us all, no matter who you are, treating others with dignity is non-negotiable. If you enjoyed this story and want more like it, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell on Dark Stories. Don't forget to like and share to spread the message. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one on Dark Stories.